Good morning and welcome. Thank you for joining our breakfast briefing. The sun is shining directly in my eyes, but fortunately through a blind, and hopefully it is where you are too. Thank you again for joining us from all over the world. I appreciate the different time zones here. I'm delighted to be chairing this session, this breakfast briefing titled Leaders in Data from Surviving to Thriving, and to have two fantastic panelists with me. The format of this discussion is a fireside chat, and I plan to make a couple of quick introductions to our esteemed panelists and set the scene before discussing what does help leaders thrive with data. So before I make the introductions, just a quick intro to this session. Building on Louise's comments, obviously we've all become much more aware of the role data is playing in our lives over the last year and a half, 2 years. But if we think over a longer time period, over the last 35 years, as businesses and organizations working to drive and generate value, the percentage of intangible asset value of the world's leading businesses and organizations has almost tripled. And collectively now, most analysts agree that intangible assets comprise circa 80 to 90% of the value of the world's largest companies. During the pandemic, when social distancing necessitated a shift towards remote working and large scale and much faster use of digital services, investment in these intangible assets increased even further. And in a report published earlier this year by the McKinsey Global Institute, all the evidence points towards companies who master investing in this area as companies that will outperform their peers. At the Open Data Institute, we want to steer and influence leaders to think of data as critical infrastructure. And on balance sheets, infrastructure is typically treated as an asset. But what are the business leaders steering these companies today? Do they get data and do they really see it this way? Are these business leaders appropriately data literate? Not every business is fortunate enough to be able to invest in having chief data officer, although we're seeing more of those roles emerge. So these are the sorts of themes we're going to discuss this morning. And a quick introduction to my fantastic panelists. I'm delighted to be joined by Edwina Dunn OBE. Edwina is chair of the UK's Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation and chair of the UK government Geospatial Commission as well. Edwina is a data science entrepreneur who has always been fascinated by people's stories and motivations. After successfully building and exiting Dunn OBE, which was the business which conceived what we now take for granted as loyalty card schemes, Edwina founded other data and information businesses, as well as a social educational charity. The female lead is that charity and is dedicated to finding and tackling factors which limit women's success and opportunity. It does this by increasing the visibility of success stories that women have in all walks of life, and offers girls a wider selection of role models than those represented in traditional popular culture that we've become accustomed to. Edwina, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to have you here this morning. And up with Edwina is Paul Wilmott. Paul and Edwina know each other quite well, so that's great. Paul is chair of the UK Government Central Digital and Data Office, which sits within the UK's Government Cabinet Office. Alongside his role in this function, Paul is Chief Digital Advisor with the Lego brand group, and he's actually joining us from Denmark today, I believe, near kind of Lego HQ. Paul has a background of 30 years plus transforming businesses through digital means as both an executive and an advisor here. Paul was the global managing partner and founder of McKinsey Digital at McKinsey & Company during his 23 years there. Paul has worked globally and across many sectors with a focus on consumer-facing industries. He started his career as a software engineer and a technical architect. So we are very lucky to have both Edwina and Paul with us. So I'm just going to start with you, Edwina. What do you think the current level of interest is from board directors in data, and what is driving that interest?
Well, thank you, Stuart, and thank you for your kind introduction. What is driving it? Well, you know, in my experience, a lot of decision making for many, many years has been, let's find the data that agrees with my instinct and experience, and then let's use that to defend the position that I want to take. And I think that has been a large part of the way, you know, major decisions have been taken. I think there is a real tipping point now where businesses are beginning to realize that actually data can really sometimes give insight that is not what is expected. It is kind of not counterintuitive, but at least has a part that is a surprise and new. And I think that kind of decision making, that kind of action is transformational. We've seen it with COVID. We've seen how understanding priorities and people who need, you know, inoculation faster than others can be rolled out, you know, super effectively. And so I think that awareness has really been very, very fast and very global. And so I think we're at a real tipping point.
Thanks, Edwina. Paul, I mean, you've worked with boards all over the world, both in your consulting years and I guess now as a non-exec. When you talk to leaders in major organizations, what do you see as most driving their interest with data?
I think, well, first of all, thanks, Stuart, and good to have the chance to interact with everybody today. Looking forward to your questions. I think the situation is very varied, honestly. It depends on industry, location, and so on. So in my career, I think we started seeing data come onto the board agenda in some industries over a decade ago. I'm talking, you know, data as in rich data and advanced analytics. Financial services, as the businesses sought to understand risk, who are risky customers and who are not to lend to. Retailing, trying to understand supply chains, which products are going to sell out and which are not, in order to restock efficiently. Telecommunications for churn and so on. And so, you know, in some sectors and some countries, that was an early process. I think, to Edwina's point, what's happened, particularly over the last couple of years, is this is high up the agenda for everybody. And what it has done is, you know, exposed, you know, that riding tide, if you like, has exposed the solid boats and the leaky ones. What I mean by that is that some businesses are very well prepared, both from a people and skills point of view, a leadership point of view, having the right people on the board and so on, but also from a technology infrastructure and deep technical capability. You know, I've seen some scrambling, let's put it that way. I think, you know, if you look at the public sector, I think they would admit that the early days of COVID were a scramble to try and assemble all the right data sets and get them in one place and make them truly accessible and visually interesting, you know, for ministers to relate to. But that's been actually a very helpful process because it's, you know, it's exposed the opportunities, but also what needs to change.
Thanks, Paul. So one of the things we're seeing a lot at the Open Data Institute, certainly an increasing amount of in the last year, is organizations approaching us asking for help with building data literacy capability. But what we're also seeing is that the definition of what data literacy means is different according to who we talk to. If we're talking to leaders of large organizations, major government departments, any organization with lots and lots of people, what do those people at the top table need to have to be data literate? Edwina, how would you kind of say, well, I'm dealing with a data literate board leader, how would you kind of define what they might need to have as skills?
So I think, first of all, there's got to be an awareness of what is interesting and useful data. I mean, I think, you know, we clump it together as if it's a sort of single homogeneous thing. I seem to have appeared twice on my screen. I don't quite know how that's happened, but I will leave that to the experts. So it's not homogenous. There's useful data and good data. And then there's data that really has the potential to change the way in which an organization organizes itself and makes decisions. So I think, really great data leaders have an awareness of the data that they have, the data that they need. And I think also they have embedded within their organization the idea that when people come to them with an idea, with a recommendation, or even with a question, that they start to bring data as evidence to support that. So it's not just my instinct, my gut is telling me. It's like, here are the facts, here's the trend, this is what we're seeing. And so, for me, the beauty of data is you don't have to be as clever as maybe, you used to have to be, because data kind of helps everybody to be much brighter and much more lucid in the arguments that they make. So I think for leaders to kind of set that expectation right through the organization, bring me evidence, bring me facts, is really the opportunity to be transformational. And then to know that when you know that fact, you're going to do something differently. What you have to kind of avoid is that, well, that's very interesting, because it's like, well, it's interesting, but you haven't done anything with it. So long as you're then changing something because of it, that makes a massive difference.
Well, that's fascinating. So you've talked effectively about culture, driving a culture of trust and transparency through the use of data, and trust, I suppose, because everyone up and down is going to trust that decisions are going to be made on what the data is telling people. And perhaps that is kind of different to the way lots of organizations have operated. Paul, you talked about sectors being different. You referenced financial services as obviously having worked with data for years for risk profiling. But what do you see as the kind of the critical foundations for data literacy with board leaders across all sectors? Where are the laggards? Where are the leaders? How does everyone get to the level playing field?
I think maybe the best way into that is to talk about what leaders can do and the actions they can take. Because I think in every market you see laggards and leaders in any industry. So the starting point is quite situational. One thing that is useful, of course, is understanding the starting point, and there are various tools and benchmarks around, including your own, to get a gauge on your current level of literacy and competence. But the first thing I've always said to leaders is you have to start by upskilling yourself. And the way that I like to think about this, and it seems to resonate with data, and I think with technology more broadly, is that leaders need to be competent enough to ask smart questions. It's a little bit like accounting. To be a leader, you don't need to be a chartered accountant, but you need to be able to look at a spreadsheet and spot when things aren't quite working. I think it's the same with data. You need enough literacy to be able to at least pattern match and see, understand what is not quite where it should be. And that can be difficult, but I think I've seen many leaders who take themselves either do a course, one of these open source courses, or take themselves off for a week to learn about technology, or just dig into sponsoring one or two high profile projects in order to get up to speed. Second thing I would say for leaders is build the right extended team. Can be about having a chief data officer, can be about having the right people on the board, can be just building capability low down the organization, but you have to have the right people around, and of course the right advisors as well. And then the third thing I'd say is understand where the value is. The reason that financial services started with risk measurement is that's the thing that moves the P&L the fastest. And in every industry, there is something that will move the P&L quite quickly. And if you start there, you prove the point. And when people get used to the notion that data has high value and that you should trust the numbers, not as much your gut that you used to trust, that starts to make the change the culture in the way that Edwina was talking about.
Well, that's interesting. So we've got some questions coming in. Use the word culture again. I'm going to jump straight to the first question from Robin Carswell, which says, can you speak to the challenges of building a culture of trust and transparency in a scenario where you may not trust the underlying data itself? That's a pretty good question. Edwina, I'm going to throw that one to you.
Well, I think we all know that there's a huge difference between what you say and what you do. So I think the first thing about a culture is, you know, people are very, very smart and they work out whether, you know, you really do listen to the data or not, or whether it's just a kind of, yeah, we've got some analysts we've hidden away or got locked away in a cupboard somewhere, and we get them out when there's no other way of looking at this. It has to be right through the organization all of the time. I mean, in terms of, do you trust your own data? I think that has to be faced really head on, which is, you know, your data should always be foremost in your mind, and, you know, you should be investing in how you collect it and what you collect. You know, there's a saying that I've used throughout my career, which is be careful because you get what you measure within an organization. So if you measure sign-ups, acquisition, then what you get is a lot of acquisition. You might also at the same time have a lot of churn. So you might be acquiring really, really fast, but what you're not measuring is the fact that you're losing customers really, really fast as well. If you don't join those two up, you think you're doing really well when in fact you've got an incredibly leaky bucket. So you have to be aware what you're measuring, what KPIs you're already using within the business, and then make sure that the collection of that data is really accurate. I mean, we used to find companies who, you know, because operators are really, really smart, if it's faster when you're collecting data to just hit a button that says, you know, what is the reason you contacted us? There's one that just says other. All the operators will hit other because it's faster. And so what you get is this massive category of another reason that someone's contacted your company. That's actually what you get. That's when you begin to doubt the data. That's when you have to sort of change the KPI so that you are getting the insight and the value that you really, really want. And then when you believe that, you can also then look at what contextual data you can get and fill in some of those gaps that you really need.
Thanks, Edwina. So I think you've highlighted a whole range of approaches across the kind of I suppose, the cycle of both collecting data, managing it, and ensuring the flows join up. I mean, Paul, what about yourself? I mean, that's a big question. I want to just sort of dwell on that a little bit longer. I mean, what sort of challenges have you seen out there where you've worked with organizations who have perhaps not had data they can trust? I mean, how do they go about building trust in the organization if the data is something that they're uncomfortable with?
Yeah, I think actually having data that people trust is an essential foundation for this dialogue and for the organization to move on culturally. And of course, there are a number of reasons why the data might be untrustworthy. It could be poor systems and technology. It could be using the wrong sources. It could be collecting the wrong things, as Edwina says. Sometimes it's actually down to internal politics, where multiple data sources which are conflicting because people are trying to, use the data for their own agendas. What I think is essential is to have some clear standards on data and someone who can be trusted to say this data is reliable and this is not. And that's really one of the main functions of a chief data officer, as I see it. I don't think the chief data officer needs always to sit around the top table, though it's helpful if they do. There are many good examples of CDOs a little lower down, but somebody has to put their hand up and say, I can tell you that this data source is trustworthy and is the standard, if you like, for this organization. The other thing that's helpful is to have clarity on what data is really rock solid and repeatable and reliable versus other data which is more anecdotal, and that can be flagged well visually to allow people to get a sense of where there's room for debate versus what should be taken as solid truth.
Thanks, Paul. So we've got a couple of other questions coming in around resources and tools to help data leaders get started, and we've talked about that a little bit already. So I want to just kind of staying on the thread around culture at the moment. I want to jump to a question from Miranda Sharp. If data is so valuable for the world's enterprises, are we changing the way we think about sharing data openly? Edwina, what do you think to that one?
Well, I think this is a really important question, and it's one of the things that we're really focused on at the CDEI, which is how can we create an environment where data can be shared and combined in a way that is considered, safe and ethical. And what are the frameworks that can be introduced to make sure that that happens in a way that is transparent to the public, and where they can kind of see, there's value and where the value is being created, and kind of also to make people aware that I think inevitably there are always some risks when data is made public, especially where data is shared across multiple platforms, and really to set those out so that the rewards can be seen to be far greater, the benefits and the rewards, than the risks, because it's never a 100% clear situation. So I think data sharing is definitely the future. The reality is most data is quite unexciting, almost boring. And, the truth is that for data to be really insightful, it quite often takes some time and investment. I don't just mean financially, I mean in making it usable, but also bringing in other context. And that means having great open data sources and great frameworks and clarity around data sharing. And when everybody becomes more familiar with that, I think, we can all innovate much more confidently, which I think at the moment is missing in the landscape, which is that there's a fear that, am I doing something that is breaching a rule and is causing concern?
That's a fascinating point. So I suppose you're saying that it's not kind of the most exciting work, but actually opening and sharing this data in time can enable people to do a lot of the hard work that might not be the most exciting stuff, but actually can reap the benefits medium to longer term. And I suppose you're highlighting the fact that we have come off the back of a decade of scandals with data, new regulation. I mean, we're somewhat in our infancy in this sector. I mean, what do you think about? I mean, that to me is a question worth spending a bit of time on, Paul. So are you seeing change in organizations that you're working with? Are people more willing to share data as a result of the pandemic than they were?
Broadly, yes, but I think this is, as you said, it's early days. I can see a number of trade-offs, including open versus proprietary, what's shared versus what's held, personalization versus privacy. I can give you a better experience by using data about you, but in doing so, I need to hold more data about you. And global versus local, different jurisdictions have very different approaches, legal, regulatory, and so on, and ethical stances on data. So there's, for global organizations, there are complex trade-offs there. And I think in all of these trade-offs, there is more work to be done. Our frameworks and models and even our language is not that set in stone. And to draw maybe a topical comparison, this is a little bit like climate change 15 years ago, where everybody was facing into the problem, but there was not a common, the language of net zero and so on had not been developed. The frameworks, the ways to collaborate have not been developed and so on. I mean, arguably there's more to go on climate change as well. But I think we're going to see a lot happen in the data space over the next decade as these frameworks get sealed down, and we see intercompany and inter-jurisdictional agreements on how data is shared and under what terms, and with what controls and accountability.
Thanks, Paul. I mean, just you've raised the international piece around different perceptions, different jurisdictional regulations. We've actually got a session, a plug for a session at 3:30 on geopolitics of data at 3:30 this afternoon with some fantastic people who have views and experience from around the world. So we've got questions about the resources. Like, let's get practical for a second, Edwina. So, we've got a question. I'm just going to read a couple out to make sure they get heard. What are the minimum skills and capabilities that every organization leader must have today to be confident they are maximizing the value of data? We've got another question that is kind of, what are the best resources for getting leaders to realize that access of data is key to success? Let's put those two together and get your perspective on that, Edwina.
You might have to remind me about the second one when we get going, but no, I think this is important. I mean, number one, I think people have to understand what is meant by the data that's held within the organization. So what is the language that's agreed? What are the definitions? What is a current customer? What is a good customer? What is a lapsed customer? What is a high value customer? Do you know what? We could all come up with 100 different definitions. So making that really, really clear and making sure everybody's talking about the same thing and, quite honestly, measuring the same thing is not insignificant. That in itself is about dealing with, interdepartmental rivalries, differences, all of those things. So bringing that together is an ambassadorial role that is really critical. And then if you combine that with the second concept, which is really important, which is when something is going wrong in a business, when there is a decline in something that is really fundamental to the success of a business, there has to be an openness and a non-blame culture within the organization to have a look at the data and say, honestly, where is it going wrong? Where is the problem? Are we losing people like this? What are their characteristics? What are we doing to them that's making them, leave us in the thousands? That honesty, again, is a rare quality. And to create that culture is not an overnight easy thing to do. But with data, you need to have it, get it out on the table, get everybody round it, discuss it, because it's only when you understand a problem that you can actually solve it.
Thanks, Edwina. The second part of the question was resources for the leaders. What kind of things can they do to get started? I think you've got some pointers on that, haven't you?
Yes, I mean, I think the main thing is not to just have a team that is isolated, who are the experts, that everybody has to sort of wait in a queue to deal with. I mean, that was the old way. I think now to have people who may not be the ultimate expert, but they're translators, and have them embedded in every team, and to kind of move them around the organization so that they begin to they begin to change the culture of, this is straightforward, this is easy, this is just a mindset. It's not about knowing a programming language. It's just about familiarity and really asking the right questions. I think that begins to change the success of an organization. It's kind of breaking down the barriers between, I started my career at a time where you had technical people and non-technical people, and the two kind of did not get on and did not particularly respect each other. That has gone. I think in a way, technology is an enabler and data is the language that brings us all together now.
Thanks, Edwina. And just very kindly, Edwina's actually given us 12 steps of things she thinks leaders can do and get started with, which I've shared out on social media with the hashtag ODI Summit, that people can look at 12 steps from thriving, not just surviving with data. So thank you, Edwina, for that. We've got a question specifically for you, Paul. Can you comment on the different challenges business leaders and specifically politicians face when leading with data? We've obviously seen politicians having to put their hand up a lot with data over the last year and a half. What's your perspective on that? And obviously, you're mindful of your role here with the government.
Yeah, I think the challenges are somewhat exacerbated actually in the public sector, simply by accountability, scrutiny, and privacy concerns. The state, on one side, the state has an obligation to collect enough data to be able to intervene when necessary. For those interested, I was involved in a select committee by the House of Lords on vulnerable children recently, which we were talking about how to spot a vulnerable child and intervene at the right time. It's helpful to get data from health services, education, police, social services, and so on, and to draw a picture across and look at patterns across that information. Of course, for the majority of us, the notion that all of that data has been collected and combined and sifted and analysed is a breach of privacy. We have with power comes responsibility, and that's no more important, or it's most important actually in government. That is the challenge, and that leads to some rich and important debate about the trade-offs, some of which I mentioned earlier. I think if I look at what's the same, though, I think that politicians and leaders more broadly, officials, are understanding and have understood even more so over the last couple of years just the value of data in understanding the starting point, understanding the areas of need, and channeling resources where they really matter and make a difference.
Thanks, Paul. We've got a couple of minutes left, and I think we've talked quite a lot about, or you've implied that we're talking quite a lot about large organizations. Obviously, here in the UK and in many other jurisdictions, most organizations are quite small. So 90% plus of UK businesses are SMEs. But we've got a question that goes further than just talking about businesses for a second, from Sasha Fries. It says, in a political and place-based environment, how can we build the capabilities to harness data to drive better outcomes for our residents, communities, and businesses post-pandemic? I think that's a really interesting question. Edwina, what's your view on that?
Well, I started my journey in data and technology in a world that is now very much the geospatial world. So I was looking at patterns geographically. And one of the first things I did was, work with companies like Experian, who were looking at what are the differences between postcodes, translate that, what are the characteristics of communities? And I'm truly fascinated by this. And I think the world of location data, which essentially is what geospatial is, it has yet to be fully realized because, Paul talked eloquently about pattern recognition, and really being great at data is all about pattern recognition. And we are incredibly different within countries and across countries, but rather wonderfully, there are similarities also between communities and between countries, and they're not the ones that are just, neatly divided up in the sort of political and geographic boundaries. And so understanding these, I think, opens up brand new and exciting opportunities for making communities feel connected, but also understood. And that, I think, can be valuable.
Thanks, Edwina. And I think that's a great piece to close on. Many geospatial people I've talked to, or people that work in that field, are increasingly wanting that field to join up more with others, in the same way you described the distance between tech and kind of data roles before. Everything happens somewhere, I was once told by someone in geospatial world. And this has happened this morning virtually, and it's been a fantastic discussion. Really thanks to Paul and Edwina for charging their coffee cups, particularly, well, Paul, actually, sorry, you're an hour ahead, I guess, aren't you? Or are you an hour? Or have I got that wrong?
It's fine. It's nearly 10 o'clock here.
Yeah,
not so early.
So it's good to have both of you with us today, and I think I've pushed out on the chat the 12 steps that Edwina shared, that she thinks certainly from a resources point of view, a bunch of the questions coming in were what can we do to get started. I think, as Paul said, there's a load of courses out there, many of them free. Of course, the Open Data Institute would love to help organizations who want to work in this area. We've got tools and capabilities that are openly available for everyone to use. And yeah, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Thanks.